So good to be here tonight. Welcome to this event. Let me just say there are 2 more of these this fall, and we are really striving here at the RFI to kind of raise the profile here and create a platform for young professionals in DC. You know, there's so much always going on here, so many types of events and hearings and information and seminars, and you know, you could start in the morning and 5 days a week go to late at night and never stop. But we really want to tailor something to the young professional. And so this is why we're kind of extending this event through the year, featuring just some of the best speakers you could find. So thank you for being out for that tonight. Let me introduce our honored guest for this evening. It's always affirming to be invited back to your alma mater. You know, sometimes some of us are invited back as a speaker or performer or a panelist, but Dr. Tom Hibbs was invited to return to his alma mater as the first alumnus to serve as president of the University of Dallas, where he received his Bachelor of Arts in English in '82, his MA in philosophy in '83. He also completed his MMS and PhD at the University of Notre Dame, and we have some Notre Dame grads here tonight. Tom, if you've not met them, you'll want to do so before you leave. Tom was also tutor at the Thomas Aquinas College for 3 years before moving to Boston College. At Boston College, he served as full professor and chair of the Department of Philosophy. Following upon his time at Boston College, Baylor University brought Tom on board in 2003, and through the spring of this year, Dr. Hibbs served as Dean of the Honors College and Distinguished Professor of Ethics at Baylor University. He is a prolific author. He's published more than 30 scholarly articles, and he has written, edited, or contributed to over 12 books, including 3 on the thought of Thomas Aquinas. And if you move in those circles, you'll recognize that Tom is recognized as an Aquinas scholar, particularly in Catholic circles. His most recent book is Wagering on an Ironic God, Pascal on Philosophy and Faith, published by Baylor University Press, and he's currently writing 2 books, one on aesthetics and one on liberal education. Tom is really a modern day cultural philosopher. There are very few of those today. He's regularly called upon to comment on film and popular culture, published more than 100 reviews and articles on film, theater, art, and higher education in a number of different high-profile publications. Perhaps my favorite communication from Tom came a number of weeks ago when he sent me a text attached an article he had just written on Seinfeld, on the anniversary of Seinfeld. My children and I spent a lot of time laying in the floor watching Seinfeld, so I was quick to send that article written by Tom to each one of them, and they were glad to receive it. Tom and Stacy Hibbs have 3 children, 2 of whom are Baylor alumni. Sarah, who is currently a Baylor student, and most importantly, an RFI intern. Few people really are genuine Renaissance men. Tom Hibbs is one of those. He's an academician, he's a sports historian and statistician, he's an expert on the arts, he's a cultural philosopher relevant to our day. So welcome me and or join me in welcoming Tom Hibbs. You need a water here.
I'm good for now.
Okay.
Thank you. It's really an honor to be here. I have, for a long time, admired the work done here at RFI and in its previous incarnation as the Religious Freedom Project at Georgetown, which Baylor, when I first started to get involved in DC programming, one of the first things we did was to have an affiliation with the Religious Freedom Project. And Baylor continues that relationship, and the University of Dallas now has a relationship with RFI. So it's great, and David's been a friend for many years. And thank you all for being here. I want to recognize Mitch Muncy, who's here, who's a UD guy from way back and has kids at the University of Dallas. But more importantly, you have him to blame for not for my interest in film and philosophy, but for my being able to do this as a kind of avocation, because Mitch edited and Tom Spence published my 2 books on film some years ago. And Mitch was the one who really taught me how to write for non-academic audiences, which us academics often have trouble doing. So I'm honored that Mitch is here and grateful for all the work he did with me over the years. He and Catherine Lopez at National Review are the 2 people who really taught me how to write for a wider sort of audience. So I'm going to talk about, in about 40 minutes, a topic that should probably take a whole semester of studying film and reading texts, about Hollywood's views of religion and liberty. I was led to think about this particular question at an RFI event where Tim Shaw was doing something. He does a lot of things at RFI. He was either giving a talk or doing an introduction. His introductions are so substantive sometimes that you feel like you gotta talk. You got a free talk with Tim. And Tim mentioned at one point, posed a kind of question that I think I have right, that all this work we're doing on religious liberty and on legal matters and protections across the globe, and particularly here in the United States, will these continue to matter at all if in certain civilizations there's simply a loss of an affirmation of the reality of a transcendent order? So if large portions of a society come no longer to believe in the reality of God or in the reality of anything higher than the human, will all our talk about religious liberty matter? It still matters, right? Because there are legal protections and there are precedents and so forth. But at a deep level, the claims that RFI and many of us want to make about religion and liberty will cease to resonate in the minds and hearts of many citizens, or at least we'll have to make a much tougher case to make to persuade them that they ought to take these matters seriously. And I think that popular culture has a certain level of impact on how we think about these things. I want to set aside a couple things at the beginning that I'm not going to talk about, and one I almost started to talk about there, which is what's Hollywood's relationship? What's the relationship of our popular cultural products to the wider culture? Does Hollywood lead or does Hollywood reflect? We've got this really violent movie out, The Joker, and there are already questions about whether a film like that could lead people to want to imitate what's going on in the screen. My own view, put really crudely, is that it can play something of a role. I'm happy to talk about that afterward. But an awful lot has to have gone wrong in the soul of the viewer already for someone to watch any film that has a lot of violence in it and say, hey, I'm going to go do that, right? That just watching a film like that does not produce in most of our souls a mimetic response of wanting to imitate it. But it's an interesting question. I'm not going to talk about that larger question. There's a complicated relationship. I'm also not going to be talking tonight about what's come to be known as the Christian film industry. That is, films that are principally made by Christians, for Christians, and any non-Christian friends they can drag to see the film in the hope that they might become Christians. Actually, there are a lot of these now, and an increasing number over the past decade. People saw things like The Passion of the Christ in Hollywood generally and thought, wow, an R-rated film with subtitles in Aramaic, and it made a boatload of money. So and Hollywood is nothing if not craven for fame and money. Principals can go to some extent out the door. But I'm not going to talk about those films. I'm interested in more in kind of mainstream Hollywood products that touch upon religion and film. So, and I'm going to start with the hostile relationship between Hollywood and religion and liberty, at least as liberty used to be understood, and move toward some, at least, examples of things that I think are more positive, although they're not really directly intended to support religious liberty. I think there are three stances, maybe you'll add to this, sort of thinking about this in the last couple weeks, that Hollywood can take toward religion that would seek to undermine it. The first is simply to ignore it, marginalize it. Actually, this was the strategy of most of the classic sitcoms in the late 50s and 60s and 70s. Almost nobody prays. Occasionally you have families that go to church or pray, but it is not woven into their daily lives in the way it was at the time, woven into the lives of most Americans. It's not to say that there's an active hostility necessarily toward religion, but if you decide in your reflection of American life simply to ignore the widespread practice of religious belief, that's one way of kind of subtly undermining the significance of religion in our lives. The second way, which has become much more prominent in the last 20 or 30 years, is to depict religion in such a way that it's seen to be antithetical to the human good, especially to human freedom. You want a crude example of this? The old movie Footloose, right? Which is kind of a fun movie, but it's about uptight Baptists who don't want to dance, trying to keep young people from dancing. Do you even know Footloose, this movie? Wow, that's good. Classical education here, Footloose. And you know, I think in this category, the line from William Blake, priests in black gowns were making their rounds and binding with briars my joys and desires. Right? This is a view of religion as fundamentally oppressive and opposed to our natural desires. If we had people quoting Blake like that, we'd be a much better culture when they were criticizing religion. It's usually much cruder. But so the second thing has to do with freedom. The third, more radical thing is to associate religion with psychological sickness. There actually are, I've watched occasionally and then I looked up, but TV series like Law and Order or Special Victims Unit, where with some regularity, the monstrous person who is molesting children or abusing an aunt or killing people, that's rooted in some sort of religious disorder. If you watched Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, you saw the Opus Dei priest Silas, right, who is indeed a sick dude, right, and comes out of an abusive childhood and is a puppet of an ecclesiastical leader and kills lots of people. There's this scene which I thought about showing, but since he's naked from the back, I thought I would spare you that image here while we're all together this evening. But it's of him lacerating himself, right? Inflicting corporal punishment upon himself. That's increasingly a way of depicting religion. There are lots of kind of mainstream to off-kilter horror films where the really bad person turns out to suffer from some type of religious psychosis. So ignore it, treat it as antithetical to human freedom, or treat it as a kind of sickness. This is really a radical move, in part because, I mean, there's some exceptions to this, but in say the genre of really bad guys in horror films and so forth, starting in early 61, 62 when Psycho came out, Hitchcock's great film, in our culture, in the horror film, it's not so much about evil anymore as it is about a kind of sickness. So there's a really weird, messed up, usually dude, rarely a woman starring in this part, And it's no longer about the complex mystery of evil. It's about how weird and sick this person is. I'm guessing that the Joker, which I haven't seen yet, is going to fit into that tradition of modern horror, where it's not so much about evil as it is about a disproportionate sickness that terrifies us. I'm going to focus on part 2. I've said really all I'm going to say, except if you have questions about ignoring it or treating it as a sickness. I think the really interesting question, and the question, since we are talking, we are at the Religious Freedom Institute, I figured I should have a topic that fit with religion and freedom. But this is the key debate in our culture. And I'm going to show a clip in just a moment. But I should say that my thinking about these matters in our culture is deeply informed by 2 papal encyclicals, by the thought of Aquinas and others. But in the analysis of contemporary culture, it's really informed by 2 encyclicals of John Paul II, The Gospel of Life and The Splendor of Truth. It's also deeply informed by this wonderful, The Best Thing that Lewis wrote, I think. There are a lot of contenders for best things, so you can throw things at me if you disagree with this, but The Abolition of Man. I think if you put those 2 encyclicals and The Abolition of Man together, you can really understand the disorders of our current civilization. So I want to start with a clip that, let me give a background on this. This is the best place to see the depiction of the opposition between religion and human freedom is in films about abortion. It's just the clearest place where this shows up. So in older films, say a film like Alfie from 1966, which Michael Caine, who's in this movie, he's not in the scene we're going to show in the Cider House Rules, is involved in that film. Abortion is treated as a necessary evil in certain tragic circumstances. This also used to be the mainstream liberal political view of abortion. And if you want to sort of measure where things have gone in our culture, consider how we got from that view, which was dominant in the 60s and the 70s, to shout your abortion. Right? How do you get from, if you want to talk about the culture and its view of freedom, how do you get from that older view of abortion as a tragic necessity that everyone feels horrified at, no one feels good about, to shout your abortion? The Cider House Rules, a film that was won some Academy Awards, up for almost all of them, touted by Planned Parenthood as their big film, that, when Hollywood says we're not shaping the culture, we're just reflecting it, watch the Oscars, right? They're cheering for their genius and their genius transforming American culture in ways that they want. It's a complicated issue, but they don't really believe that when they say, we're just reflecting the culture, we're not shaping it, because they think they're all artistic geniuses who are changing the world. So this is a film that's set in an orphanage in New England. Michael Caine is a doctor who takes care of orphans, and in a back room, he performs abortions. Tobey Maguire, Spider-Man, is an orphan who's grown up and has become a kind of medical protege without any official training of this doctor. They're a complicated plot. The scene that I'm going to show, though, is, to my mind, one of the most remarkable scenes. There's actually a part that they cut out from the video release that was in when I saw it in theaters that I'll mention at the end of this. But you have the Cider House is an apple orchard where illiterate African-American families work. There are rules on the wall of the Cider House. And what we're going to see is a scene where the Tobey Maguire character pulls it off and they say, what does that say? Because they can't read. And Tobey reads the rules. What you also need to know is that there is a man, an African-American man, who has most of the speaking part in here. I think his daughter may be in there too. This is an ugly scenario, but she's pregnant by her father. So Rose, the daughter, is pregnant by her father, Mr. Rose. And clearly the rules that are on the wall of the Cider House are supposed to, in some sense, mirror the historical prohibitions against abortion. What I want to focus on is not the question of abortion itself so much here, but how is this depicted in the film? And how is the tension between the desire to have an abortion and traditional prohibitions against it depicted? Okay. Roll the film.
There should be no going up on the roof at night.
Now, why don't they just say, don't go up on the roof?
That's it.
That's it.
That don't mean nothing at all. And all this time I've been wondering about them.
They're outrageous, them rules.
Who live in this side of the house? Who grinding up those apples? Person that side of cleaning up all this mess? Who just plain live here, just breathing in that vinegar? Well, someone who don't live here made those rules. These rules ain't for us. We the ones supposed to make our own rules. And we do. Every single day. Ain't that right, Homer?
That's right.
Well, why don't you burn them rules in the stove?
Go ahead, Homer, do it.
Okay. So you have conflated or equated here rules that are imposed upon peoples who've had no say in the making of the rules. And obviously we're supposed to think of slavery and civil rights in that context. Very serious issues in their own right. The rules against abortion are being treated as the same sort of thing. Rules that are imposed by others that we have nothing to do with and made by people who don't have anything to do with us. One of the chilling parts of that presentation is the man who's defending getting rid of the rules is the one who has assaulted his daughter and made her pregnant. The other thing that happens is that Tobey Maguire will go on a couple scenes down to perform the medical abortion of the young woman. Right after that scene in the theater, but not, you won't find this in any videos that are available. Right after that scene of the abortion, which is not, I mean, it's shown from a distance. There's nothing graphic about that. Right after that scene, there is an immediate movement of the camera to the roof of the cider house where they've been told not to be up there, and all of the cider house workers are on the roof. And when I was in the theater, everyone laughed at that scene, right? Because it is funny that they've been told not to go on the roof, and they're like, this is a stupid rule, we're on the roof. But notice what's going on in the parallelism, right? The suggestion is that we're to think the same thing about the rules against abortion, right? That they are as trivial as don't go up on the roof. A really striking way of depicting this so that the prohibitions are seen as alien to not just human natural instinct, but appropriate human freedom. If you move ahead, we had this sort of year, I did a bunch of interviews, probably Mitch arranged these when we were promoting the book. But there was a year where we had a bunch of interestingly sort of weird pro-life films. Bella was not weird, but you had films like Knocked Up, Juno, Waitress. So, and there was all this talk that Hollywood was undergoing this kind of pro-life. You know, the interesting things about, except for Bella, the rest of those films is that they never really get out of the realm of being pro-choice, right? What they do in effect is to recognize that this could be a good choice for some women in some circumstances. What's the good choice? The good choice would be to keep the baby in that case. But if you come to just I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago now, there's a film called Obvious Child. I'm really depressing you guys here. You don't need to watch all these things. And this was so Cider House is a turn. Obvious Child is a much bigger turn. So Obvious Child, there's a stand-up comic female who is going through a bad breakup, gets drunk, has sex with a guy, becomes pregnant. She tells her mom about this, that she's pregnant and thinking about having an abortion. Her mom's response is, "I'm so relieved. I thought you were going to move to LA." She's about to go on stage the night before she's scheduled to have the abortion, and her friend says, "Kill it out there." And she says, "Actually, I'm doing that tomorrow." This is all in a film. The abortion itself occurs on Valentine's Day with her new boyfriend. These are big shifts, right? There's a big shift from Alfie, where it's a tragic, necessary evil, to Cider House, to Obvious Child. What's going on here? What's going on here is not only the suggestion that these traditional obligations are opposed to human freedom, and we should no longer think that they make any serious claim upon us at all, right? It's not just that there are serious things there that I've weighed and I've chosen to do what I'm going to do. There's nothing here worth taking seriously, right? And nothing in here worth taking seriously. But notice what happens with this. Notice what happens to freedom, right? Freedom itself gets changed. It's not just that the prohibitions are seen to be opposed to freedom. Freedom becomes, Robbie George wrote an article. He's always writing great articles. He was in town last night. I think he's coming back tomorrow. He's just on the train constantly back and forth. And love Robbie. But he wrote a piece for First Things a couple years ago arguing that Christians need to study the heresies of the early church because they're more relevant now than ever. He picked Gnosticism, right, as the heresy that's popular today. The denial that the body has any real claim on me, that the body has moral significance. Actually, in this case, Robbie didn't go far enough, because if we were dealing with a Gnostic culture, we would have a culture that thought there was a superior order to the body, right? Because the Gnostics believed that the body was unimportant because the spiritual and transcendent were all important. What we have today, I would emend Robbie's thesis to say what we have today is Gnostic consumerism. It's a view that the body has no intrinsic significance, and whatever significance it has is because of my personal preferences, just like I like to wear this clothes or eat this flavored gelato or drink this kind of coffee, right? So there is in this argument that wants to, it's an argument in a way. I mean, films are not directly making arguments, but these films are coming pretty darn close. It's an argument that wants to do away with the need for an argument. This is so insignificant that we shouldn't even be debating it. Why is it insignificant? Because choice is simply consumer preference. This is the biggest way in which Hollywood over the last 30 years has indirectly affected our understanding of religion and very directly affected our understanding of freedom. Because almost every film you watch, even if it doesn't have horrors like the ones I just described, or like are in the Joker or whatever, are frequently focused on what's celebrated is the self-expression of whoever the main character is, becoming authentic. And in lots of cases, who can argue with it? There's nothing intrinsically wrong, except if your conception of freedom reduces to consumer preference. That means there's nothing outside of my own will validating my choices, in light of which I could say, this is a good choice, this is better, this is bad. There are no standards by which I can say these are better or worse choices. That's known as nihilism. the absence of any standard of good or evil or of truth or falsity. And the left is playing a pretty dangerous game here, because once that's unleashed, it doesn't just touch the things that they want to attack on the right. It attacks everything, right? So, how do we get out of this mess? Let's get out of this mess. So, and this is a theme, it's actually a theme in these encyclicals I mentioned. It's also a central theme in a much misread encyclical of Pope Francis, Laudato Si. The key theme in Laudato Si is not climate change. The key theme is how this corrupt understanding of freedom has led not only to our moral tarnishing of ourselves, but to a pollution of the entire environment. And he very closely follows both Benedict and John Paul II on the intrinsic connection between natural ecology and human ecology, the inseparability of these things. But it is, and he quotes Benedict repeatedly, a false conception of anthropocentrism, where the human is at the center and all value is determined by arbitrary choice. Let's call on Batman to get us out of this. We need the Batman clip. Right? Only Batman can save us now. You didn't expect that, did you? Yeah. That's the campy version, not the Christopher Nolan version. Yeah, me too. Yeah, I got you. I knew exactly what you were referring to. This is from the first of Nolan's trilogy.
Master Wayne, you've been gone a long time.
Yes, I have.
You look very fashionable. Apart from the mud. Are you coming back to Gotham for long, sir?
As long as it takes. I'm going to show the people of Gotham their city doesn't belong to the criminals and the corrupt.
In the Depression, your father nearly bankrupted Wayne Enterprises combating poverty. He believed that his example could inspire the wealthy of Gotham to save their city.
Did it?
In a way, their murder shocked the wealthy and the powerful into action.
People need dramatic examples to shake them out of apathy, and I can't do that as Bruce Wayne. As a man, I'm flesh and blood. I can be ignored, I can be destroyed, but as a symbol, I can be incorruptible. I can be everlasting.
What symbol?
Something elemental, something terrifying.
I assume that as you're taking on the underworld, this symbol is a persona to protect those you care about from reprisals.
You're thinking about Rachel?
Actually, sir, I was thinking of myself.
Have you told anyone I'm coming back?
I just couldn't figure the legal ramifications of bringing you back from the dead.
Dead?
You've been gone 7 years.
You have me declared dead?
Well, actually, it was Mr. Earl. He's taking the company public. He wanted to liquidate your majority shareholding. Those shares are worth quite a bit of money.
Well, it's a good thing I left everything to you then.
Quite so, sir. And you can borrow the rolls if you like. Just bring it back with a full tank.
There it is. So a couple things quickly about this. One is he says at one point Gotham is not beyond redemption. There's this religious language that shows up, and then the notion that people need symbols, signs, stories, examples to inspire them, right? But they don't get symbols, signs, stories that inspire them through Gnostic consumerism. They don't get it from people whose whole view of choice or freedom is simply choosing whatever I find preferable at the moment. Batman is binding his own freedom to a city, right? He's binding his freedom and risking it for the sake of the city. And so this is not directly religious. Sort of religion is kind of absent. But there are occasions where there are alternative conceptions of freedom that we find attractive, right? I think we're attracted to this character because he binds his freedom to something greater than himself. This is not the popular view of freedom in either Hollywood or our culture, I would say. I want to show one more. I got a couple minutes still, David.
Yeah, it may take us a couple of minutes to get that queued up.
Okay. This is the Lord of the Rings one. Do you think it'll work or not?
Yeah, let's go for it.
So I can talk a little bit while you're working. So here's the other thing that as I say, there's a lot to talk about here. Here's the other thing that I think is really important about our culture when it comes to religion, which is that there is a dominant narrative in Hollywood and in American culture that is quasi-religious. It's rooted in romanticism. And by that, I mean something that goes back to Rousseau, and then I don't mean, between the moon and New York City falling in love at first sight. I don't mean that kind of romantic. I mean the tradition of romanticism, right? This tradition shows up all over the place in our culture, and Christians are often tempted to confuse romantic stories with Christian stories. E.T. embodies every thesis of this view of romanticism. There are things that are natural and organic. There's that little plot of woods at the beginning that makes it seem like you're in a forest, and then you come out into Southern California and it's all electrified. There are things that are natural and organic. There are things that are artificial and non-organic, good, bad. There are people who are children, good. There are people who are adults, bad. There are people who are connected to their emotions, good. There are people who spend a lot of time in their own heads, bad. This is really crude, but it runs through a lot of and it's straight out of Rousseau. So, and if you want to see the best, most powerful, and most popular expression of this in our popular culture, watch Avatar, right? Because Avatar has a bellicose American, I think it's the Bush regime, supposed to be, right? It's a bellicose, driven by technology, and we're destroying ourselves, and we need this thing, what do they call it? Really creative name for it? Unobtainium is what it's called. We need that thing we can't find, unobtainium. And we have to go to this place where there are these creatures who are animal and human. They live around a sacred tree. They don't use artifice. This is the dominant positive myth in our culture. And it's in almost every film in Hollywood that has a happy ending. I would say that the happy ending of expressing one's authenticity, that's a word that comes out of Rousseau as well, right? This is not calculative, it's genuine expression. It also undergirds our fascination with reality TV. Why? Because what we want is the unscripted, the natural, not the artificial. Right? The first reality TV show was MTV's The Real World, and pretty quickly you could go online and see videos that gave you the real story behind the real world. Right? So you're getting something more authentic than what you were seeing. Duck Dynasty is a sort of, I like Duck Dynasty, but it's a version of this as well, right? So, and I take it that what Francis is doing in Laudato Si is attempting to show that narrative, which undergirds the ecological movement, the environmental movement as well, right? What's good, what's natural and organic, what's bad, what's human and rational and calculative and artificial, right? This is at the heart of the modern environmental movement, goes back to Romanticism. What Francis is doing in Laudato Si is trying to show that you can't actually defend that view of nature without being a theist, without believing in God, without being a follower of St. Francis. Pardon to the Dominican friend here, but Tolkien has a way around this, which if I had a couple hours, we could talk about in detail. But I want to play this great scene, which is Arwen giving up on Aragorn, apparently, and going off to the Undying Lands. And she has a change of heart. Let's see if this, I hope this rolls. Okay. I'll say something quick about this and then we'll end.
Take her by the safest road. A ship lies anchored in the Grey Havens. It waits to carry her across the sea. The last journey of Arwen Undomir.
Lady Arwen, we cannot delay. My lady!
So she goes back and confronts her father, who has told her there's nothing but death if she stays, and she needs to go. Yeah.
What movie is this from, just for context?
Lord of the Rings, which one is it? I'm trying to... Which one is it? Return of the King. Thank you. I've got these things separated out so much in my head. So she goes back and confronts her father, who's told her, go to the Undying Lands, give up on Aragorn. And she says to him, you said there was only death. He said, there is. She said, no, there's a son. This is not in the book. Right? I mean, there is a expanded story about Arwen and Aragorn in the appendices to Lord of the Rings, which Peter Jackson chose, I think, wisely to put into the main plot. Otherwise, you just have a bunch of male hobbits running around, which is fun, but it has a limited appeal. But the other thing that happened was there were female assistant filmmakers with Jackson who said, she needs a stronger motivation. I mean, he is great looking, right? Especially the actor. But simply being in love is not enough motivation for her to give up peaceful eternity. And that's when they came up with the idea of a child. Right? Also, watching that scene, I mean, Jackson got some things wrong from the book, but he did a heck of a job putting Tolkien into a different medium. Because doing a good film version of a book is not just a matter of getting the dialogue right and the settings and the clothing. It's really a matter of delivering the experience of the book in a completely different medium. That scene could have been done, there's a little bit of dialogue, it's actually remembered dialogue. It could have been done without any dialogue at all, just because the images and the sound are so perfect. And the child running, and the child turning and looking at Arwen, and Arwen looking at the child, that's all you need to know. It's just a set of images. It's where film is really powerful in its own medium. What's going on there? And why did I used this a lot at the end of talks. I didn't use it today because I started with abortion. And here there is a kind of affirmation. I think this film, I was thinking of the film Arrival. It's a really interesting film where there's something like this seeing of the future and embracing a child in the future. Really brilliant film. Here, again, our romantic comedies almost never, they end with people together, but that's almost never because part of the reason, make this really complicated, has to do with seeing in the person you've fallen in love with the possibility of children. That's almost never in our romantic comedies. And yet, historically, and I dare say in our souls, this is a natural feature of falling in love. It's right, it might not be what starts it out in being attracted to another person. They might be attractive or witty or rich or drive a certain kind of car or whatever leads you in. But if you're genuinely in love, there's some sort of recognition, I want to be with this person, and children, right? That's a natural instinct of the human heart. That natural instinct has been edited out of almost all of our romantic comedies. And yet, in Jackson's version of Tolkien, he adds something to Tolkien that puts it back in. Right? This is also, in Tolkien's overall view, a way of thinking about the harmony between the natural and the human, really complicated analogies that Tolkien develops in the book and that I think Jackson does a pretty good job with, that leads us to affirm the reality of a transcendent order. Right? Both in what we're experiencing, there's something transcendent going on here. And that's why the images and the music are so crucial to that, because they lead us to saying we're not just seeing bodies coming together, we're seeing souls coming together, right? It also, obviously in the plot, right? When the eagles come, that's a sign that there's some sort of providential structure to things. So this is complicated, and I've run through a lot of things quickly, while it is the case that Hollywood, often when it thinks about it with respect to religion and freedom, is attacking religion as being antithetical to freedom, and thereby, without usually acknowledging it, transforming our understanding of freedom and depleting it of its richness, there are still experiences in our lives and in some of the greatest films that move us back in the direction of a richer conception of freedom, of something that my freedom is a response to that which calls me or binds me. That's paradoxical, right? Because we like to think of freedom as an indifference from the external world. There's no pressure on me, I do what I want. But the deepest kind of freedom, Batman's freedom, Arwen's freedom, that's not consumer choice, right? That's something, someone, something in my experience that calls me and evokes my freedom at a deeper level and binds me. So that my freedom actually, and of course, the term religion, right, means to be bound, right? In the root of ligio is to be bound. It's not just a choice that we make that's a lifestyle preference. It is a notion of being bound. Insofar as that notion of freedom disappears from our culture or becomes more marginalized, we will have a harder time making the case for religious liberty. Thank you.
Tom, if you would just stay at the podium.
Yeah.
And let's just open up the floor. I mean, we want this to be as informal as you'd like it. So raise your hand, and great time for questions. Tom knows all films, so I'll put him on the spot.
Don't do that. First question will be about something I've never seen. Yeah.
Do you think that Gnostic consumerism is at odds at all with the left's opinion on certain recent cases like Masterpiece Cake Shop, where they're trying to take away conservatives even having consumer choices?
What I'm definitely not is a constitutional lawyer. You had the famous Kennedy phrase about the mystery of the universe, that everyone has the right to define the mystery of the universe. And that's an interesting claim, but people like Hannibal Lecter and Charles Manson have their ideas of how to define the meaning of the universe, and we don't want to say. So it's a temptation to want to trivialize choices. I don't know if there's something in the particular case, because I know about those cases just from media reports.
Yeah, so you touched on this a little bit, but I'm curious what you think. So it seemed to me, I really love classic movies, so I watch a lot of like 30s and 40s films. But you can see a pretty marked shift, like you said, between movies like the golden age of Hollywood to movies that are, late 60s, early 70s.
Yes.
Strong deference to realism later. When do you think, you said the 60s, but what do you think made that shift?
So I think there are two big breaks. And choices there. It's this great philosopher who just died recently, Stanley Cavell at Harvard, who wrote a lot about film. And he wrote a book, you'll like this, because it's all about, what he calls comedies of remarriage. So the Philadelphia Story, there are a bunch of these, right, where people are married and get divorced or separated, and the film has them coming back together, right? And Cavell interpreted this as an American way of saying that when we get married in America, we're too young and don't know what we're involved in, and we need experience. But in America, what that allows us to do is through the experience to reaffirm the original commitment, right? That's now gone. We don't have comedies of, well, maybe here and there, but they don't have the same shape as they did in the old day. That's one thing about those classical films. So I think what happens is in the mid to late 60s, you get the production code being removed. So our filmmakers have a lot of freedom that they didn't have before. I think you actually get some really creative, dark, but really creative movies in the late 60s and early 70s, which is when I first started watching films. And they're really creative because you had people who had to be really talented before, because they couldn't just go for the graphic depiction of violence or sex, right? I mean, if you watch stand-up comics today, if you're flipping around on TV, I mean, it's just so, Seinfeld looks like a master of indirect locution, which he is, but compared to this stuff where it's just a matter of being more and more direct and explicit and crude, and that's supposed to make you funnier. The same thing's happened in film, right? So in the 60s and 70s, you had all these really talented people who worked under the code and had to find creative ways to say what they wanted to say, right? I think that you get, so there's a big change there in the early 70s. I think by the time you get to the early 90s, I mentioned Hannibal Lecter, but this is a moment. 91, Silence of the Lambs wins Best Picture. By the way, the author of that book is a Baylor alumnus. Something went wrong in his religion classes at Baylor way back in this. Tom Harris is a Baylor alum. But you get an evil character who's more fascinating than any of Jodie Foster maybe is interesting, but the evil character is more interesting, right? You also have Scorsese's remake of Cape Fear in 91, which is there's a great classic version of that in 62, where the reason it's so terrifying is that we believe there are innocent people and bad people. In the remake, that's not there. There are no innocent people that we sympathize with. So what happens in the late 80s and the 90s is that our sympathies shift from innocent victims to the entertaining bad guy who's creative, clever, sees through things in ways nobody else does, and does all sorts of things that we're just in awe of. Right, Hannibal Lecter is smarter, he's better educated, he's got better tastes, although that's a tricky word with him, than anyone else in the film, and we're in awe of him. Right? The problem with that is, and you're getting Hibbs's genealogy of film here in like 3 minutes, you asked this question. But what happens there is it's subject to the law of diminishing returns. So there's only so long you can do this, and suddenly, which happens actually by the end of Silence of the Lambs, right? He's escaped, and he's in the Bahamas, and he calls Clarice, and she says, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm having an old friend for supper." And down walks Dr. Chilton from the Baltimore Psychiatric Institution. We know what's coming next, fava beans and Chianti in Hannibal. But people laugh, right? Why? Because this is evil that's not really evil. It's a kind of sheer depravity or sickness. There's no mystery in the evil. And evil can be taken seriously, that is not turned into comedy, only if goodness is also taken seriously. So horror films, my daughter knows not to get me started on this, horror films can be occasionally really interesting, and people who work at the edges of it, like early Shyamalan, middle, late, nobody knows what that guy's doing. Bad filmmaking. But the early Shyamalan is working at the edge of the superhero genre, the edge of the horror genre, and it's about what? It's about suspense. It's not about horror. It's about suspense, and it's about the mystery of evil and the mystery of goodness. Right? So you do see returns to this, but the dominant trend, 70s into the 90s, is a really unhealthy one, in part because of what it does to us as viewers. Right? The Hunger Games actually is raising this question. Right? Suzanne Collins said that she wrote the book flipping between images of the Gulf War and reality TV. Well, what do you get then? You get what I call CNN compassion, right? Where you see images of horror in your neighborhood or across the globe and you say, "Aw," and then you flip to the Kardashians and you say, "Aw," really bad. So, but our emotions are no longer deeply sympathetic to those who are innocent and good. That's the real danger in the kind of move in popular culture toward evil as entertainment. Yep. Yes, really brilliant film.
Curious what your take is on it. Does it mark another moral shift?
Lots of great Simon and Garfunkel songs.
Yeah.
Really excellent soundtrack.
Are we supposed to feel compelled by the affair that he has? How are we supposed to look at?
So how many of you have seen? There's a scene at the very end. It's a great. I'm thinking about it. Yeah. Well, no, when they leave and they're on the bus together, when they've escaped from the wedding that she almost had. and they're giddy that they pulled this off. And then the camera stays on their faces and they go stone cold. They have no idea what's next, right? And he's in that MG or whatever it is, up and down the coast, almost the whole movie, right? He's running, but he's running to win something that doesn't really give him. I think he's actually, because Nichols actually had something of a Christian education, the filmmaker. He's one of Hollywood's great filmmakers. But he's kind of got that Pauline theme of running and run so as to win. But then what he wins, what is this? Do we really want to be together? We don't really love one another, right? What's next? Well, what's next is a marriage, some kids, lots of drinking, affairs, boats, cars, divorce. That's what's next, right? Because they're not bound by anything. And they don't really love one another. It's all been about a kind of rebellion against that which was acting against them in the older generation. It's a great film for capturing a certain kind of rebellion and presenting it as really attractive, and then showing if your only conception of freedom is freedom from, negative freedom, and you don't have any conception of freedom for, positive freedom, you can get rid of all those things that you think are oppressing you, and you're going to have a completely meaningless life. Because you wouldn't know what to do if you weren't casting off things that you think are oppressing you. Which I think is actually a strong motivation in our culture for certain people to want zealously to be about the casting off of allegedly oppressive things. I mean, this is not fair entirely, because there are a lot of things that people need to cast off. I don't mean to put all those things together. But it seems to me the zeal and the pervasiveness of this, and the way in which it doesn't seem to be vulnerable to reasonable conversation, strikes me as rooted in a deep fear that if we actually had to think about what we were living for, we wouldn't have a clue if it wasn't freedom from. And The Graduate, I think, shows that. Brilliant. By the end, they got nothing. Yeah.
So, in Quentin Tarantino's films, there seems to be a very
now here we go.
Yeah, there seems to be a very consistent theme that there's the bad people, and then there's the less bad people who kill the bad people. And I find it very interesting that he puts a sort of filter for reality that's like everybody's horrible, but the people who are sort of backed by the fact that they either repent in the case of Pulp Fiction and Jules from Pulp Fiction,
I know where you're going.
Or they are not quite as bad, like in some of his other films, The Hateful Eight and that kind of thing, how there's a really, really bad people, and then there's the really bad people who aren't like satanic, essentially.
Right.
But everybody dies, or most people die, in that kind of thing.
Brad Pitt in Once Upon a Time, the film that just came out, is one of my all-time movie heroes. But with some, it's just such, the scenes are just so great. I'm going to try and say something brief, because I will talk for hours about Tarantino, which I have very mixed views about. What Tarantino's one of the things Tarantino's really good at is this aesthetics of evil. Right. The visual depiction of, he's actually much better at it than the people who do horror films, because they got a budget of like 20 million and they're trying to make 30. That's why horror films always come out on a Friday in February when there's nothing else coming out. And they can be number one, and they're low budget, and they got all the guys your age go see them. Maybe not you, but a lot of that's their market. It's you and all of the people all the guys your age. And Tarantino's a kind of high-level artist of this, of finding really creative ways to depict violence. Right. He loves it. Mel Gibson loves it too. The Passion is a really good film in lots of ways. It's not perfect. It could have been perfect. Could have been perfect if you let Shyamalan edit it. That's my thesis about The Passion. I actually wrote an article about arguing that. With Tarantino, so I think Pulp Fiction is a great film. I don't think any other of his films. I think Once Upon a Time is a really, I wasn't even going to go see it until I read a review by Rod Dreher, who's a friend and whose judgment I don't trust on everything, but I do trust on film. And I emailed with Rod after, and I said I had the same experience he did of watching that. You should pick up his review of Once Upon a Time. But on Pulp Fiction, and I wrote about this in the Shows About Nothing book that Mitch tells his kids who like films that they ask him if he's seen something. He said, but I know I read about it in Hibbs' book. So now I don't have to watch it. So I helped Mitch out there by freeing him from having to watch these films. But Pulp Fiction is really interesting because it suggests that to find your way out of this world where violence begets violence endlessly and where it is glamorized, so that even if we wanted to end it, we're addicted to it, right? This is Suzanne Collins is testing this with the Hunger Games, right? We have to ask, like the people in not Pandora, Pan Am? Is that the name of the central area? Who are bound together by the ritual of innocent young people killing one another. Suzanne Collins is saying, well, what are you doing watching this movie? What draws you to violence? Now, eventually we have innocent people to cheer for against bad people, right? But at the outset, what we're being entertained by is innocent young people killing one another, right? And she's sort of testing our instincts on this. What Tarantino's suggesting in Pulp Fiction is that this would require a conversion to, I think Samuel Jackson believes that he saw a miracle. I think he believes, as he says, God got involved. What does that mean? Well, I don't know. But what I need to do is spend the rest of my life trying to figure out what it means that God got involved. Wander the earth like Cain in Kung Fu, right? And like the other Cain, right? I think that's actually a series. And the Bruce Willis character is the other character who makes his way out. Why? Because he breaks the chain of violence. Both of them break the chain of violence. And the chopper that he rides out of town has on the side of it the word grace that Bruce Willis is. Now, I don't want to make Tarantino into St. Augustine here. Please don't say Hibbs did that. But I do think the logic of the movie, it suggests that to make your way out of this world that we increasingly find ourselves in, where violence begets violence, hostility begets hostility, where there's no possibility of forgiveness or mercy, and where we find violence glamorous, we find it titillating, right? The suggestion is in these films, it appeals to the same thing. It appeals to erotic desire. It's not just appealing, as Plato thought, to thumos, the desire to fight. The way it's depicted is actually appealing to eros. And you got the two most intensive things, intensifiers in our visual experience: sexuality and violence. And when those two come together, this is really a powerfully addictive thing to us, whether it registers consciously in our minds or not. Tarantino knows that. Mel Gibson knows that. He knows the logic of that because almost all of his films are about that at some level. They also know, and Mel knows this in The Passion, right? Because he's trying to do a self-inflicted exorcism in that film. That the only way out of that is for someone to take violence into himself or herself and end the chain of violence and to show it in its horror for what it does to the innocent, so that you no longer could even be tempted to see violence as glamorous. Tarantino, I think, is suggesting that in Pulp Fiction, but most of his other films are just about the glamour. Yeah.
So I was very struck by the clip that you showed from Cider House Rules and your comment that the way that you were trying to focus on what Hollywood is doing to
Was that, was my interpretation persuasive?
It was, yeah.
Okay, well, I'm wondering if you have objections.
Well, I guess this is an objection to your point. The objection is the idea of Hollywood's portraying or kind of like moving the culture, trying to shape the culture so that we see religion as not tenable or not actually possessing authority because of the fact that there are rules that we didn't choose.
Yeah.
But I'm also thinking about, like kind of the most essential aspects of American government and what a lot of even conservative scholars who are studying like the founding of the Constitution, that kind of thing, consent to kind of early modern political philosophers saying that authority comes from the people.
Social
like
contract
the right
theory,
to govern. Yeah, the right to govern comes
Yeah.
from the people who are governed,
Yeah.
saying. And so I'm wondering, like, obviously America also has, like a Christian founding in some sense,
Yeah.
because like a lot of people who came over were Christian
Yeah.
refugees of sort. But is there really culturally a way forward, or like this seems like a tension between like the culture that we have just almost from our identity as Americans
Yeah.
and how we are governed and our conception of what it means to be American in a political structure
Yeah.
versus the culture we want to have as Christians of saying.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say on this, right? So let me say something really quick. I think there are lots of traditions feeding into the American founding. Locke is feeding in, and Locke, despite his reliance upon Richard Hooker, is not a Thomist. I mean, there are residual elements of Aquinas and Hooker and residual elements of Hooker in Locke, which means there are still residual elements. It's not that it's not there. So there's the tradition. I mean, some of us were at the Baylor event last night on the Bible in American history, stressing this really rich contribution that we miss now, because if we read those documents, we don't get the biblical allusions because we don't read the Bible as a culture. So the one thing I'd say about this in relation to contemporary culture and the topic of freedom, and maybe religion, but mainly the topic of freedom, is that the American founders were not full social contract theorists. Right? Social contract theorists imagines an impossibility, namely that we all start out as fully formed adults, that we just skip the process of growing up. Why do we have to skip that? Because that process is a process of initially complete dependency on other human beings, right? So social contract is a clean slate theory. I have no obligations imposed upon me that I didn't consciously and contractually enter into. Well, the only people who can do that are fully formed adults, but they're never fully formed by social contract theory. They're formed by having dependencies and obligations on other people, right? So the extent to which a social contract theory, a version of it, now permeates our culture, that leads to the consumerist view of choice. Because any contract I make, I can, under the right circumstance, unmake, right? There's nothing that binds me absolutely to a contract. That can always be renegotiated or just opted out of, and I take the penalty, whatever the penalty might be. And the penalty is external. It's not harming my soul. It's somebody going to take something from me if I opt out of it. This is very clear in Locke. Right? Why do you not want to violate this? Because somebody will do the same thing to you. It's not, as Aquinas thinks, that if you're vicious, you're going to be a miserable human being. So that's a big difference, I think, in the American founding is not fully social contract, right? And the great line on this matter from Joseph Pieper, maybe we wrap it up, but Pieper, in the great German Thomist, in his writings on justice, says that the just man who understands his life to be a gift will recognize that he has debts that he has, before he's able consciously to recognize them, let alone affirm them, and that he has debts that he can never fully repay. God, country, parents, teachers, coaches, friends, war heroes, political leaders who've made possible the kind of freedom that we have. Am I indebted to those people? Was I indebted to my parents when I was born? Am I indebted to God in a way, and my teachers? Not that God and teachers are the same, but there is a similarity, right? I mean, Aristotle treats them as somewhat similar in the sense that they've given you gifts that you can never repay. What do you express in that case? The very unmodern virtue of gratitude. Right. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. So many themes tonight to unpack, right? Responsibilities that come with freedom to the transcendent, to fellow human beings, to the natural order, to community. Not just freedom from things, but freedoms actually that carry with them responsibility. That's part of our mission at RFI, to help define what freedom and religious freedom frees you from, but also empowers you to do the free exercise of religion. I was thinking tonight, standing in the back, how much fun it must have been to grow up in the Hibbs household. There's Tom in the recliner. He always has the remote, I guarantee you. And as they watch a movie together at night, he's got the popcorn. There's Sarah and the other two children. But every 3 minutes, he hits the pause button. Sarah, do you mind taking this and kind of, extrapolating some of the themes about freedom from that short clip, and then we'll continue with the movie tonight. Just wondering if it was really like that.
Me in my own dark room.
Listen, so great to have all of you here tonight, and Tom, thank you very much for this fun evening. I mean, where else in D.C. tonight, within the framework of freedom and religion, are you talking about Avatar and Batman and Duck Dynasty? Probably nowhere else. So good to have you here. We'll look forward to you attending October 10th, I believe, is the next event. Don't hurry off. There's still plenty of food out there and some drinks, so circle around, get to know each other, and invite your friends. Thank you for being here tonight very much.